And welcome back to Consumer Choice Radio, broadcasting here on the Big Talker, 106.7 FM, and on Sauga 960 AM in the Peel Region, Ontario. We have, we've had many debates and conversations on this program. We've talked a lot about some forward-looking legislation, trying to really understand and get the lay of the land as to what's happening. And we are very lucky and honored to have on our program today U.S. Representative Nancy Mace of South Carolina's 1st Congressional District. She has introduced an amazing bill, one that we have been very supportive of, that deals with cannabis decriminalization and trying to change the scheduling up there in D.C. So, Congresswoman Mace, thanks so much for coming on the program.
And thank you for having me.
So there's a lot of things that have come out about the bill. There's been analysis on the left and the right. Before we get into that, though, we'd love to hear a bit more about your story. Obviously, South Carolinians, North Carolinians who might be listening might be more familiar with some of your work in the state. But let us know a bit of your story, because we've read things about you in Politico. We've seen some of the headlines. You seem like someone coming out of the gate who's a maverick, but give us the real spiel.
Right. I think the headline last one I read was something like The Curious Case of Nancy Mace, quite frankly. But I represent South Carolina's 1st Congressional District, which is the southern coast of South Carolina, from just north of Charleston all the way down to Hilton Head, and mostly coast with a few towns inland as well. And I grew up in South Carolina. I was actually born at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, because my dad was in the Army for 28 years and retired a 1-star general, and retired to Charleston, where I grew up. And I'm a high school dropout. I dropped out of school when I was 17 and would eventually get my high school diploma equivalent by taking some college classes when I wasn't waiting tables at a Waffle House on the side of the interstate. That was one of my first jobs out of school when I dropped out, because my parents said, if you're going to stop going to school, then you've got to start going to work. And that was my job. And I learned some really tough lessons during some very tough times in my life. And I, most importantly, learned about the value of hard work in this country. And I also learned about, the American dream. If you have a dream and you set some goals, you work hard, you can achieve it. And in 1996, the Citadel, the Military College of South Carolina, would allow women in. And I went and graduated in 3 years at the top of my class and turned my life completely around from that experience. So I guess you could say I learned to fight while I was there, right? Fight for things that I believe in, learning about having confidence to believe in yourself. And if you believe in yourself, then others will believe in you. I think that's true in business. That's in politics. That's when you're raising your kids. And I'm a single mom of 2 kids, so that's applicable there as well. And it's important, that kind of confidence when you're legislating up here in Congress, most importantly as well. But also, I learned at the Citadel about having courage, and courage to speak up for yourself, speak up for others, and even courage when it's important that we don't always toe the line, right? If there's something that's important to us and our values that we should speak out against, having the courage to do that regardless of the repercussions. And I think those are important values that are some of the reasons why I'm here in Congress today and seeing a little bit of success in my first year.
And speaking of not always towing the line, you have introduced the States Reform Act, which would move to decriminalize cannabis. There's a lot to parse out in it. It's certainly a very consumer-friendly approach to cannabis decriminalization / legalization. But why is now the time for Congress to make a step like this?
Well, it's important. This really isn't a partisan issue. And in my home state of South Carolina, I know that it's a 70-30 issue, and 70-30 on medical cannabis, at least. South Carolina today, we allow and permit CBD, and this particular bill wouldn't change what states are already doing. And it's been about 25 years since states have started ignoring the Schedule I status of cannabis and implementing their own reform. So in South Carolina, we allow CBD, excuse me. In Florida, they have medical cannabis. In places like California and Colorado, they have full adult use. And so when you look around the country and you see there are 47 states that have cannabis reforms, all but 3 have nothing. It's Idaho, Kansas, and Nebraska that have no cannabis reforms. They don't even have CBD. But when you look at the patchwork that's happening around the country, and then you realize the federal government doesn't have a plan, they don't have a framework, we're not taxing it or regulating it. And if you want it done in a responsible way, then Republicans have to lead on this issue and have to have a seat, not only a seat at the table, but we have to have a voice. And this particular piece of legislation takes into account what and how each state is different, and it wouldn't enforce cannabis on every state unless they wanted it to. But if they do have it in any way, shape, or form, then there's a 3% excise tax, and the funds from that go to ensure that we keep our kids safe, ensure that we have funding for states that have opioid pandemics and epidemics in their states, ensures that we have good community policing programs, ensures that vets have mental health funding. And so it's a really solid bill that looks at the measures that have been either filed by Democrats or Republicans, or that have been discussed or presented as potential bills, including Senator Schumer, who has not yet filed his bill this year. This is an issue that many Republicans and Democrats ran on, and I sort of look at myself like, why aren't we doing this? This isn't hard. If you regulate it like alcohol, then it conforms in a way that is approved by every state today. It's literally turnkey right now, based on what's already happening in all but 3 states in this country. And CNBC called it passable. Fox Business last night said it's the best bill that's been filed on cannabis. There's something for everyone, whether you are Republican or Democrat. If you are pro-cannabis or even anti-cannabis, if you're pro-cannabis, this taxes and regulates it and allows it to be legal in your state where it already is. If you're against cannabis, this doesn't force a one-size-fits-all cannabis across all 50 states. So I try to make it palatable for everyone, regardless of your political affiliation or where you live, that it respects the rights of states and federalism, which is a very conservative-minded viewpoint, but also it has measures in there that would be palatable to Democrats as well. It's a really solid, thoughtful piece.
You're listening to Consumer Choice Radio. We're speaking with Congresswoman Nancy Mace, who has just introduced the States Reform Act that would look to really reshape what cannabis law would be in our country. And Representative Mace, one point that you kind of mentioned there with Senator Schumer is that there have been a lot of proposals on the Democratic side that have been discussed and talked about, and they've had power now for a good little while. We haven't seen anything. But I know that there are many tenets of this legislation that actually hit against many Democratic proposals. Particularly, we're talking about taxation. We're talking about the agency that I would actually regulate. What were some of the problems with what you've heard about some of the Democratic proposals when it comes to cannabis at the federal level?
Tax is being, first off, the tax is being way too high. Schumer's bill is a 10 to 25% tax threshold in the first few years, which really is, it's untenable. You look at markets like California that have full adult use, recreational use cannabis. They have a black market, which all that does is fund the drug cartels, right? And continues, the problem we have at our southern border as well. But when taxes are high, people will go to the black market because they just can't afford what is in the legal market. And so we have to keep taxes very low in order to ensure that illicit markets do not pop up around the country. That is one of the biggest distinctions of this bill. And then the second distinction, I would say, is the way that it would be regulated, very much like alcohol, where, you might have barley and wheat, regulated under USDA for the growing. The same thing would happen with this. Products would be like alcohol, regulated under ATF, and then the interstate commerce piece of it under TTB, and then I'm going to call it FDA light. There's not a lot of jurisdiction over with FDA except for medical uses, and states can determine medical uses, but the bill protects the rights of states to have medical cannabis and allows some oversight by FDA under the medical portion of it, both on labeling and then for those that will use it for medical purposes in those states. And so it's a really, I think, thoughtful, and I spent 9 months on this bill to make sure that I got it right. And I wanted to make sure that it was a serious piece of legislation that was comprehensive, but also clean and simple, that it just provides this framework for the federal government to get out of the way of what's already happening today across the country in all but 3 states.
Yeah, I think so. From my perspective, I've written about cannabis legalization in Canada quite extensively. And when I read the bill, immediately I thought, whoa, this would avoid many of the hiccups that happened in Canada in regards to it being overtaxed, the pharma grade regulations that hindered production, which also feeds the black market, because if it's not accessible in the early stages, well, then where do people go? They go where they've always gone. So I certainly commend you for that. Who else has joined forces with you to push to have this bill passed?
Yeah, another thing I want to add too that I forgot to mention too, there are provisions in here that would prohibit the legal age would be 21, and would be a financial incentive to ensure states conform to the legal age of 21, except for when it's medically prescribed. There's also some criminal justice elements to it as well. But in terms of the folks that have supported this bill, we have folks on the left and right side of the aisle. We have everyone from Americans for Prosperity, the Cannabis Reform Alliance, Global Alliance for Cannabis Commerce, USCC. We also have Concerned Veterans of America, the Law Enforcement Action Network, folks as well. We've got folks both in law enforcement and veterans. And then we have in the original co-sponsor list yesterday, there are 5 Republican co-sponsors. I'm angling to get a handful more this week. And then we're already talking to different Democrat offices in the House and in the Senate who have read this bill and were impressed by it and would like to work on it with us. And so in order to do cannabis, this kind of legislation, whether it starts in the House or the Senate, we've got to have some bipartisanship. And so I'm working now to add to the growing list of Republicans that are supporting the bill, and then we'll work toward getting Democrats on board. And we're in talks with many offices and to get there. And I'm really excited about it. But I want to do the legwork first and prove to everyone that this thing has legs. Republicans will support it. And then, work with Democrats on the other side to try to get this thing done or move the ball forward, because with the lack of any other bills right now that aren't bipartisan, we're not going to move forward on this issue. And clearly, Americans across the country want change. They've been changing their state laws for 25 years and continue to. And because a vast majority of the voters in this country want this kind of change. And so this genie is not going back in the bottle. And all we're doing at the federal level is we aren't taxing it, we aren't regulating it, and we're not doing it in any way in a responsible manner. And this changes all of that.
Yeah, speaking of change, it's 2021 and talking about reforming cannabis on talk radio. So I love that. But Representative...
I was going to say, too. Yeah, I was going to say one more thing. Normal has endorsed the bill, too. That was the left side. So, I have I have folks on the Republican and Democrat side in terms of cannabis groups and those kinds of things that are supporting the legislation as well.
So Representative Mace, apart from being young yourself, it is your first term in Congress, a freshwoman, as they would say. What are some of the other priorities that you have to represent your constituents in the 1st Congressional District of South Carolina? I know there's a lot of issues out there, a lot of key votes, but what are some of the other topics that you're definitely focusing on for your voters back home?
Well, certainly inflation, jobs, and the economy is really top of mind to everybody. I mean, steak is up 25%. Every time I go to the grocery store, and we're all paying more for basic food and even gas when we go to refuel. Those issues are really important, ensuring that spending doesn't continue to be out of control and that we keep taxes down. And that's really hard when Republicans are in the minority. The border is a big issue in the Carolinas as well. Every time I do a town hall, we have many questions about what's going on at the border. And then aside from that, as a freshman Republican, I sit on the Transportation Committee. I sit on the Veterans Affairs Committee and Oversight. And I'm actually the ranking Republican on a subcommittee in Oversight about civil rights. And so far this year, I've passed 3 bills out of the House as a Republican in the minority and as a freshman, one on civil rights issues, one on due process, and then one on a Gold Star Family Scholarship funding mechanism out of the Veterans Affairs Committee, and then another on cybersecurity. And, although I'm conservative, I have a habit of reaching across the aisle to get things done because I was hired to do a job and I'm here to work. And I work incredibly hard each and every day to deliver on the promises I made when I was running. And the States Reform Act, this cannabis bill, is a promise that I made on the campaign trail, as well as are all of the issues that I'm working on from civil rights to spending and taxation and the fiscal policy that will get us out of this mess. all of those things are very important to voters in my district, my state, in our country. So I'm working my tail off, and I'm loving every minute of it.
Well, Congressman Mace, thank you very much for coming on the program. I hope that we can have you back on the show during your victory lap once this bill is passed. And it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me today.